Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. In today's video, I'm recapping last night's 2026 Georgia Governor Republican primary results, where in sort of a shocker to many, Rick Jackson ended up defeating the Republican Burt Jones, who was endorsed by both President Trump and last minute endorsed by Governor Brian Kemp. It was a very close race, but ultimately the Rick Jackson, the outsider businessman, does ultimately defeat Burt Jones in this Republican primary. I gotta say, this race was a very fascinating under the radar race to watch, because if you're unfamiliar, and I'm gonna go, this is the Senate race, we're gonna go to the Georgia governor race here, because this is a really special, interesting story that happened here. We saw Rick Jackson obviously defeat in the runoff Burt Jones, but in the polling for this race, Rick Jackson essentially kind of comes out of nowhere on February 3rd, 2026. The race at that time had Burt Jones, Brad Raffensperger, and Chris Carr in the race. They were the leading three candidates. Burt Jones, still a lot of undecided vote, but Burt Jones was the leading candidate pretty much immediately. Getting the endorsement of President Trump certainly helped. But then when Rick Jackson joined the race on February 5th, he immediately had a very large amount of support for a candidate that essentially just started running out of nowhere. He had 16% in the most recent, or in the Signal poll. Then he got 24%, 22%. Qantas Insights got up to 33%. And Jackson continued as time went on to dethrone Brad Raffensperger and even take the lead over Burt Jones in several polls as either the leading Republican or the second place Republican. When the polls ended before the initial primary, Jackson led by 3.3% over Burt Jones, and a runoff election was very, very likely. Now, ultimately, that runoff did take place, and Burt Jones actually did better than expected. Jones getting 38.35%, Jackson 32.51%. Burt Jones had roughly about a 55,000 vote lead over Rick Jackson in the initial primary. So now you head to the runoff primary, with Rick Jackson and Burt Jones, and people were very bullish very early on here. You can see on the side of the screen the odds here from Polymarket. After the primary took place, Burt Jones surged in the odds here, where he was heavily the favorite, even heading into Election Day. You could see Burt Jones was still the favorite on this race until polls started being counted, and then you saw those numbers for Jones collapse and Jackson surge. So what happened? Well, what ended up being on the first round a 50,000 vote win for Jones, Rick Jackson ended up winning statewide 373,000 votes, Burt Jones 335. So you're looking at right around a 34,000 or so net win for Jackson over Jones. So he made those numbers up very significantly of the 709,000 votes cast. In terms of primaries, though, 52.65% for Jackson, 47.35% for Jones. Only roughly about a 5-point gap separating the two of them. So for runoff and primary standards, absolutely incredibly close competitive race here. And you may hear a little bit in my tone of my voice, a little bit of surprise here. And I really shouldn't be too surprised, because I did ultimately my final prediction video, which I have seen a lot of you started to watch in the last few days of the race on Sunday and Monday. I really appreciate you doing that. I did ultimately predict Rick Jackson to win by this margin of victory of about 5 points or under. So it's not exactly a shock to me that Rick Jackson won, but the momentum for a while was that Burt Jones was leading, and he had the endorsement of President Trump, he had the endorsement of Brian Kemp, but I sort of learned a little bit in the last week or so from the Texas Senate primary, where, actually, maybe the last month might be a better example, where we saw Jasmine Crockett leading over James Talarico for a while, but then we saw in the last week or so the odds really narrow up, the polls were narrowing up as well, and that ultimately led to Talarico defeating Crockett in a surge on the votes on primary day. And to me, we saw that as well right around June 9th. Jones had a massive lead over Jackson, and then we saw Jackson's numbers really start to go up from 26 all the way up to 40%. Heading even into Election Day, it really ended about 2 days before, about roughly a 50-50 race. But then again, on Election Day and the day before, as votes started getting counted, Kemp endorsed Burt Jones. Jones's numbers surged back up. But to me, I recorded the video before that, so I don't know if my prediction would have changed, but I recorded before that. The odds were clearly improving in Jackson's direction, which to me says a lot of early vote numbers may have been coming in, and a lot of enthusiasm was behind Rick Jackson in this race. But it was still incredibly close. This was not an obvious win for Rick Jackson, but he was able to do it. We just in the prior video covered the U.S. Senate race in Georgia between Mike Collins and Derek Dooley, and we talked about the map and how Mike Collins did very well in this portion of the state of Georgia. Derek Dooley did very well in the Atlanta area, but it wasn't enough because Collins really won everything else in the state. This governor's race did not go that way. This is almost like the inverse of the Senate one, where Rick Jackson, the winning candidate, he was the one to win the Fulton County, Atlanta area. He did win it by a little bit more than Derek Dooley did, but he also won DeKalb County by 17 points, Cobb County by 13, Douglas County by 15, Cherokee County by 15 as well. You see these areas that we saw Derek Dooley do well, and Rick Jackson did very well and did even arguably better. But you look at the margins here. On the southern part of the state on the border with Florida, Burt Jones still did very well in these areas, similar to Mike Collins did, but he didn't do as well as Collins did. Some of the margins in some of these counties, only about an 11-point win in Grady, 13-point win in Thomas, Charlton, only about a 13-point win. These were over 20 points for Collins in the Senate race. And then you also see Jackson winning a lot of these counties, like Camden County winning it by 9 points, Liberty County winning it by about 3, Bryan County winning it by 5, Bullock County by 5, even Effingham County by about 7 to 8. So Jackson did very well in this portion of the state compared to what the Senate race looked like, where Mike Collins just swamped Derek Dooley all throughout here. In the governor's race, it was a lot more competitive, where Burt Jones's margins in these areas that he did win, he did win them big, weren't as comparable to the Senate race, where they were lopsided victories for Mike Collins. Burt Jones just didn't reach those numbers, and Rick Jackson made a lot of significant close wins and inroads in a lot of these areas that Burt Jones had to win very decisively. Again, we can look at the map here on the governor map. Look at these areas of the state. Burt Jones won them all, even very narrowly. Like, he only won Camden County by about 2.3%. He won Effingham County by only by 5%. But look down here. Look at these margins. Yes, it was in a multi-candidate race, but Burt Jones won decisively down here in this portion of the state. Not one of these counties, south of Calhoun County here, not one of these counties and up near Savannah, not one of them went to Rick Jackson in the initial primary. But then what happened? Rick Jackson was able to make very significant inroads in these counties and picked up a lot of these votes. And this part of the state over here as well, from Columbus to Albany, was very big for Rick Jackson as well. And I'm saying this, and you would be like, well, these counties are only like a few hundreds to a few thousands of people. Do they, how big of a deal? It's not Atlanta, it's not the size of Atlanta. But when you look at primaries, like Republican primaries especially, there's a lot of voters. There aren't going to be as many voters in a place like Atlanta in a Republican primary versus Democrat primary. I saw in the prior video, it's roughly 831,000 voters live in Atlanta, registered voters live in Atlanta, but in the Republican primary, it only amounted to roughly about 37,000 votes out of Fulton County. Why is that? Well, Fulton County is a heavily Democratic area. It votes like 80-20 Democrat to 90-10 Democrat every single election. There's not a whole lot of Republicans there. So yes, it's the biggest vote center by overall numbers in a Republican primary, but when you go state by state, there's more than enough rural counties when all those votes start to compound for the leading candidate for the other candidate to be overtaken. The problem is Rick Jackson didn't just win Atlanta and nothing else like Derek Dooley did. Rick Jackson won Atlanta. He won the surrounding suburbs and rural counties surrounding Atlanta, which Dooley failed to do. But then Rick Jackson also did very well in parts of the state that Burt Jones had to win, and had to win decisively, like Screven County, like Bullock, like Effingham, like in Columbus, Chattahoochee County, like in Muscogee County, like in Marion, like Shelley, Webster, Terrell, Randolph, Quitman. These areas that aren't a lot of overall votes here, but you're padding for Jackson, plus about 140 votes here, plus about 100 votes here. Worth County, picking up about 81 votes. You're picking about 100 or so out of Doherty. You're picking up another 40 out of Terrell, another 50 to 60 out of Randolph. You're picking up only 20 out of Whitman, but these all compound. These all add up in a very close race. Again, you're looking at a race with 709,000 voters, only a difference of 33,000 votes separating, or not 33,000, I'm sorry, that math is wrong. You're looking at a difference of probably 38 to 39,000 vote margin for Jackson across the state in a very close race. The margins in these tinier counties of 100 votes here or there make a big difference. And then when you go into Fulton County, then you could see an area where Jackson wins by 8,000 votes. You could argue that was the tipping point, that he won by that much. But then Gwinnett County, Jackson won here by about 5,000 votes. Let's look in the Senate race real quick. Gwinnett County, it voted only for 3,000 votes over Dooley. So you're looking at another 2,000 votes compared to the governor's race in a place that Jackson won. Barrow County, roughly about a 900 vote win here, almost a 1,000 vote win for Jackson over Jones. Now let's look on the Senate map. We actually saw Mike Collins win here by about 5 points. Derek Dooley was not able to replicate those numbers outside of Atlanta and the surrounding suburbs into the rural areas. Rick Jackson, he won the urban areas of Atlanta. He won the surrounding suburbs like Cobb County and Gwinnett County, and then ramped the vote in some of these rural areas like Walton, like in Barrow. Jackson County, not same name, but that happened. Madison County, won here. Banks County, won here. White County, won here. It's really impressive. Rick Jackson was able to win the urban areas, win the suburban areas around Atlanta, and make significant inroads in the rural areas. So that ultimately led to about a 5-point win in the Republican primary. Now, obviously, just a quick note before we completely move on here to the general. Burt Jones, he had the endorsement of President Trump. He had the endorsement of Brian Kemp. He's a lieutenant governor of the state. Ultimately falls short in this race. Well, he won't be the candidate in 2026, but what is next for him? Well, the governor's race is up in 2030. If Rick Jackson loses the general, you may see him run for governor again in 4 years. But in 2028, there is a Senate race in Raphael Warnock. He is up for re-election in that race, and Republicans are going to need a candidate to lead that ticket. Obviously, Brian Kemp is the top Republican in the state. He's always speculated as running, but if Kemp decides not to run again, there's an argument Burt Jones will probably be one of the top 5 Republicans that Republicans may look to ask to run for that race. If you can get to the general election, you never know. So, is this the end of Burt Jones' political career in the state of Georgia? Never say never, but I would argue probably not. I think we see him run again, whether it's for Senate or maybe in governor in a few years if he doesn't win. I would bet we see Burt Jones' name again. Typically, when candidates run for a primary, especially if they make it to the runoff and they come very close to winning it, we usually see them at least run 1 or 2 more times for whether it's the same race or for a different race. So I don't think this is going to be the end we see from Burt Jones. But now we got to talk about Georgia as we move to the general election. So now we know Rick Jackson will officially be facing off against Keisha Lance Bottoms, the former mayor of Atlanta, in the general election primary, or in the general election, And this is going to be one of the most closely watched races in the United States. Aside from Inside Elections having a tilt Republican, every other political prediction site has it listed as toss-up. And that is very, very significant. There hasn't been a whole lot of polling in this race thus far on both Wikipedia and on the PollsMax website, which I started to use more frequently now in recent videos. Keisha Lance Bottoms leads only from one poll from the Signal poll, and their average 49 to 43. That was also with Burt Jones. So now they don't have polling for Rick Jackson versus Keisha Lance Bottoms yet. So from a polling standpoint, we only have 2 polls to go off of. A Democratic poll sponsored by a group that's likely supporting Keisha Lance Bottoms shows Lance Bottoms at 53%, Rick Jackson 38%. And typically the way it works is when it's a party-affiliated poll like Democrat or Republican, they're usually skewed by about 4 to 5% is usually the general rule of thumb that I use to account for the bias of the poll. So if you're looking at here, you're probably looking like a 15-point win for Lance Bottoms here. That would probably signify more around like a 10-point Democratic win, but still 9% undecided though. Echelon Insights, a Republican poll, this was sponsored by Net Choice, is a Lance Bottoms lead of roughly about 6 points, which that actually doesn't spell too good for Rick Jackson, because using that same 6-point lead memo, shifting about 4 to 5 points here, you're looking around a 10 to 11 point lead for Keisha Lance Bottoms. So using that general rule of thumb here suggests heading into this race that Lance Bottoms has a very strong lead over Rick Jackson. But this is why I wouldn't read into this too much. A, there's only 2 polls, smaller sample sizes with very large margin of errors, 6.5% and 4.3%. But Rick Jackson, despite winning the Republican primary, he's also, I believe, like a billionaire, like very, very wealthy, so a lot of his own money bringing in to this race. He's the leading Republican candidate for governor in Georgia. He's going to get a lot of the Republicans coalescing around him. He has the endorsement of President Trump now, so pretty much most, if not all, of those Burt Jones voters will coalesce around him. I bet we're going to start seeing polls narrow up in this race. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily he's going to be leading in these polls. I think Keisha Lance Bottoms, seeing as we're looking in the Senate race, the few polls that we have for the Ossoff versus Mike Collins race already has Ossoff leading by about 4.5 to 5% or so. I wouldn't be shocked as Ossoff is really trying to help Lance Bottoms get across the finish line as well to win this race. If we start getting more and more polls out in the coming weeks, that we see Lance Bottoms win or lead over Rick Jackson by a smaller amount. I wouldn't be shocked if the first poll we get out of a well-known reputable source like Emerson shows a close race, but shows one where Lance Bottoms is leading like 48 to 44%, or maybe like 50% to 46% or something like that. And my reasoning for that is Lance Bottoms, she won the primary, so she already has like a month head start or so in terms of getting to the general election, getting voters to know her. She was also the former mayor of Atlanta and has the complete backing of the Democratic Party, including the incumbent U.S. Senator who's also up for re-election. Rick Jackson's going to be a Republican that has a lot of money, but is not very well known across the entire state of Georgia unless you voted in the Republican primary, and roughly nearly half the state didn't vote for him. So I expect Rick Jackson to be down in the polling for a while now, but as the rankings said, it is a toss-up because Georgia's going to be very close. I mean, we've seen the past few elections in the state of Georgia only voted for Trump by 2.2% in 2024. Even in an election where you see a state like Arizona swung to Trump by 5.5, Nevada went from roughly about a 2-point Biden win to roughly about a 3-point Trump win. Georgia only swung back towards Trump about 2.5%. So it's going to be very close in that standpoint. 2020, Biden was able to win the state by 0.24% after Trump won it by 5% in 2016. At the governor level, Brian Kemp won re-election in 2022 by 7.5% against Stacey Abrams, but in 2018, in the first open race that they had, it was very close. Brian Kemp very narrowly avoided a runoff, I do believe, winning by 1.4% against Stacey Abrams. So it was an incredibly close race, and we're likely going to see a very incredibly close race again in the general election in the state of Georgia. We just don't have enough polling data right now to have that play a very big role in this race, but in terms of what I'm expecting, no surprise, I currently have 9 governor's races listed as toss-up, which I have anything as a 5% margin of victory or under, and I think we're going to see Georgia be one of, if not the closest governor's race in the entire country when everything is said and done. Whether it's Rick Jackson pulls off the win or Keisha Lance Bottoms nearly pulls off the win, it may take a runoff, it may not. It may be under 3 points, maybe under 2 points, but we're going to see an absolutely tough fight in the state of Georgia. And it's going to be interesting because the Republicans have held a long state-held control over the governor's race in the state of Georgia. We did see on the Senate race that wall break in 2020. So could Keisha Lance Bottoms win this race in November? She absolutely can. Could Rick Jackson, though, with how much money he has, find a way to eke out a narrow victory and keep the governor's seat red? That's also possible. So I really think it's going to be very, very close. We're going to have to wait and see also. I think election environment will play a large role here. If things remain the way they are now, with high gas prices and President Trump's approval ratings down in the mid to high 30s, Georgia's probably going to go blue at the governor level. But if things rebound from now to November, we may see Rick Jackson start to pick up there, and maybe he ends up pulling off the win here. It's really a jump ball in Georgia, and I truly mean this. Of all the toss-up races across the country, Georgia, to me, may be the closest of all those toss-ups. So a very important race, a very critical race, but now the matchup is set. We know Rick Jackson will be facing off against Keisha Lance Bottoms after he defeated Burt Jones last night in the Republican primary. For now, that is it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd really appreciate if you could hit like and subscribe for me as well. And you see, as I post more videos, I post a new video every single day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I really appreciate it if you could hit like and subscribe. It really helps me and the channel out. So for now, that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you in a future video.